Next item of business is a debate on motion number 5541 in the name of John Swinney on the Budget Scotland number 4 bill. Could I invite all members who wish to participate in the debate to press their request to speak button.
Shirley-Anne Somerville, to be followed by Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As the Cabinet Secretary and various other speakers have already said, these are exceptionally difficult economic times. Labour and the Conservatives can argue, as they have done today again, about the cause of the recession, but the truth is that this is a world economic downturn, but it is also a recession exacerbated by the mismanagement of the public finances at a UK government level. Future budgets will be even harder to construct, however. With a general election looming, we remain under the threat of an emergency budget, of further future public spending cuts and the consequences for Scotland. But what we do know already, as Professor Bell stated in his report to the Finance Committee, is that 2010-11 is in effect a turning point, where Scotland passes from a benign public spending environment to one which will be as tough as any experienced during the 1970s or 80s. Now, none of this is any news to the people and the families up and down this country affected by recession and unemployment. Our task is as nothing compared to that faced by the struggling families attempting to perform their own household budget miracles in a time of rising unemployment. And it's these families that we must keep in mind as we go about setting this budget today. On the other hand, it would be wrong to delude ourselves that this institution has the powers on its own to steer Scotland safely through this downturn. This Government, this Parliament, is trying to fight a recession with one hand tied behind its back. And to illustrate this point, I'll give one example of this time last year when all parties agreed on the vital importance of accelerated capital expenditure. The agreement of the Westminster Government was widely welcomed. And again this year, as the country makes some faltering steps towards recovery, accelerated capital expenditure is seen by anybody with any economic understanding as a necessary tool for pushing us towards growth. And I welcome the Labour Party's earlier support for a repeat of that process as part of this year's budget. But because if it was the correct thing to do last year as the country went into recession, it is most certainly the correct thing to do as we drag ourselves back out of that same recession. The refusal of the Westminster Government to sanction such a reprofiling is a blow to recovery plans and a stark illustration of the constraints under which this Cabinet Secretary and this Scottish Government presently requires to work. And this is a particular setback for the housing sector, given that the Government had committed to prioritise the building of additional social housing with this money. A report published only yesterday by the City of Edinburgh Council showed that over the past 10 years, the average house price in the city has rose a remarkable 129%, while the average pay of a single full-time worker only rose by 50%. Meanwhile, we see the Council receiving, on average, 139 bids for every property which becomes available to rent. Now, while I very much welcome the funding given to the Council by the Government to begin council home building once again in this city, we can only wonder at how many more families could have been helped if that accelerated capital expenditure had been available again this year. Presiding Officer, members in this chamber are fully aware that the Scottish Government works on a fixed budget. Whether it is social housing, or the boiler scrappage scheme, or the town centre regeneration fund, or any other of the countless projects we have already heard about from the opposition members today during this debate, or Garrel, you cannot spend your money you do not have. I do not think anybody in this chamber would doubt that Garrel is a desirable project. But at this moment, committing to a non-essential project that cannot be guaranteed the funding necessary to complete it in forthcoming years is folly in the extreme. The opposition parties got it wrong on the Edinburgh trams. The decision was wrong at the time and in hindsight looks even worse now in this city as we pay for that funding shortfall, something that may have had something to do with some of the problems that the City of Edinburgh Council talked about to David McCletchie when he returned to the briefing on Monday.
Eric Brownlee.
I wonder if the member would accept that although the Parliament did vote indeed that the trams should not be cancelled, that was in a non-binding motion, and the decision to go ahead with the trams was a decision taken by the Government, of which she is a firm supporter.
Somerville.
It doesn't surprise me whatsoever, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the opposition parties, including Derek Brownlee, who voted for the trams, is now trying to somehow excuse himself from that decision. The voters of Edinburgh will not have such a short-term memory. But let's not make the same mistake again when we are starting a project with budget predictions showing that we cannot afford to complete in future years without cutting other projects. And we have still yet to hear from the Labour Party how they would pay for this funding shortfall. And we have to remember that proposing cuts is not something they have a good track record of. We can only breathe a sigh of relief that their proposals to take £10 million from the winter's road budget was ignored, and I am sorry I have run out of time. But we have heard from others about how Garrel might be paid. The Scottish CBI, for example, have suggested the sale of Scottish Water, Highlands and Islands Airport, for example. Well, politics is all about choices, and with a list of alternatives like that, I think this government has made the right one. Presiding Officer, against a background of recession, turmoil in the UK public finances and the limited powers available to this Scottish Government, the Cabinet Secretary has no doubt faced a challenging year as he has put this budget together. But it is a budget that builds on the Scottish Government's recovery plan and on the solid foundations laid by previous budgets. In a tight financial settlement, the Cabinet Secretary has had difficult choices to make, but he has done so, and he has protected vital public services such as health and education, and that will be welcomed by hard-pressed families across Edinburgh, Lothians and the rest of Scotland.